best forces to the other side of the river to reinforce. Best equipment they have. On November 1, that assault did begin, but as we all know, that wasn't the whole story. There was also a second assault right here because the Russians had to move their troops from somewhere, and the Ukrainians waited to see where they were being pulled from. And in that assault, the entirety of Kharkiv province fell within 5 days. Even better than that, this little dingleberry right here, you guys see that? That is Izium. That was the Russians' forward logistical base. It's a rail hub. They were planning on launching multiple assaults from that next spring to basically capture a huge chunk of Ukrainian territory. It fell in 36 hours, intact. And in 36 hours, the Ukrainians captured more gear, more tanks, more artillery, more shells, more gasoline from the Russians than they started the war with. More than we had transferred to Ukraine in 7 months. Big win. And then they went on to capture Kherson as well and got about half as much, again, equipment. So the Ukrainians at the moment are going through 6 months of deferred maintenance on a lot of Russian gear with the hope of getting it all into working order by the time we get to May. Which means that now we're in a bit of a different kind of conflict. Things are kind of stalled because the weather has been weird. Normally at this time in the year, everything would be frozen solid and you'd have tanks running around everywhere. But it's abnormally warm throughout Europe, including in Ukraine. It's about 40 degrees in Kiev today, which means everything's really muddy. And we're not talking like Louisiana mud here. You know, you can like have a fan boat and go over that crap. We're talking about like deep, churning, clay-based mud. And you can't run tanks through that. That's stalled everything for the moment, but it's absolutely made this a war of logistics, which the Russians aren't great at. So what's going on is the Russians are normally moving everything by train, remember? This black arrow right here pointed up, that's the Kerch Strait Bridge. That is the only rail connection from Russia proper into the southern front. Somebody blew it up a couple months ago. Kerch Strait Bridge, only rail connection between Russia proper and the southern front. So they now have to move everything by truck. You guys remember all those Javelin missiles from earlier in the war? For the most part, the Ukrainians were not using them to target tanks. You know, infantry versus tanks, that's not a lot of fun. So they shot at the trucks. Russia only started the war with about 3,000 tactical support trucks for its entire military. They have lost about 2,300 at this point. So in order to keep things running, because moving things by truck takes about 4 times as long and 10 times as much fuel as doing it by rail, they're having to go back to Russia proper and confiscate things like city buses and literally Scooby-Doo vans to shuttle things around the front. Now, you've all seen Scooby-Doo. Imagine the Mystery Machine loaded up with artillery shells. You know, you don't have to get shot at for that to get really exciting. And the explosions that we're seeing on the highways in southern Ukraine are of substance. But the real fun is not here yet. 2 things. Number 1, by the time we get to May, we're going to be in a different sort of conflict. Number 1, all that deferred maintenance will be done, and those 60,000 troops that are training in NATO countries will be back with new gear, probably including some battle tanks. It's a fundamentally different Ukrainian force, order of magnitude more powerful than what they began with last February. Mobile, precision weapons, and a lot of them. But the Russians will have completed their second mobilization, and they will have thrown at least 500,000 more soldiers into this fight, an increase of a factor of 4 from what they began with. Now, yes, they will be badly led and badly equipped and badly trained and with poor gear and low morale. But you know what you call soldiers like that? Russian. There is nothing about the war to this point that is atypical in Russian history. The first year of every Russian war is always a complete and utter shit show. And then they throw bodies at the problem. And in half of those wars, that does it. In the other half, it leads to a government collapse. It's way too soon to know which one of these it's going to be. But by the time we get to May and June, we're going to have a really good idea of which strategy is ultimately going to win in time. Doesn't mean it'll be over in June, but we should have a really good idea. That's number 1. Number two, Russia has never, ever, ever backed down from any war without one of two things happening. Number one, the government collapses at home. I think the chances of that are minuscule. Number two, they lose at least 500,000 soldiers to combat. We're at about 100,000 right now. So the Ukrainians either have to attrit 4 times as many forces minimum as they have to this point, which would be bloody to say the word, or they have to trigger a mass fatality event. And they have a way to do that. The Crimean Peninsula is an agricultural zone. Roughly 3 million ethnic Russians live there. But it's all irrigated. 80% of the food production there is with irrigation. This blue line right here, that's the Crimean Canal. Its sluice gate is in Kherson, and the Ukrainians now control it. They're not going to turn it on come planting season. The way Ukraine probably is going to win this war is by triggering a 1980s Ethiopia-style famine in Russian-controlled territory, which is where the best troops that Russia have are currently stationed. One way or another, the scale of this is only beginning to be felt. Okay. That's the tactical, that's the strategic. Let's talk about the economic. If you take everything that Belarus and Ukraine and Russia, the belligerents, do, put into a single bucket, they are collectively the world's largest supplier of the first column, second largest for the second, and so on. I could speak for hours on this one slide. I did so at the CIA for 4 hours back in October. Yeah, that was no fun at all, because they're like asking all these questions, but they won't answer any of mine. When the Soviet system collapsed back in the 1990s, the entire industrial base just went down. But they didn't lose their power generation. Now, the Soviet system was one of the few parts of the world that didn't have access to bauxite, which is the precursor material for aluminum. So what they did in the 90s, since they had all this spare electricity and no industrial production, is they imported all kinds of bauxite from other places, used their spare power to turn it into metal and then export it. Most of that bauxite came from either Australia or Ireland, 2 countries that have been relatively enthusiastic about sanctions on the Russian system. So that's shut down. Titanium, the ore comes from Ukraine, it's processed in Russia. So that's gone to zero. You guys remember Brexit? I mean, isn't it hilarious that we don't even think about the Brits anymore? As an American, I really enjoy that. Okay. When the Brits left the EU, they neglected to figure out what was next. And they've come to the conclusion, grudgingly, that the only way that Britain will be a successful economic player moving forward is if they enter into a free trade deal with the North Americans, primarily the United States. We've got some very clear ideas on what they have to do to make that happen. One of the many, many, many things that they're going to have to do is leave the Airbus family of European aerospace companies and join Boeing. This is where it gets fun. Britain's contribution to Airbus are engines